The year 2000 was a great year for gaming. Not only were there a lot of follow-ups to existing franchises, but a lot of new franchises too. Soldier of Fortune, Hitman, Elite Force, these were all released during this time and didn't just spawn sequels, but in some cases, whole franchises which still have games being released today. Now, while it was a pretty good year for fans of all genres, it was a particularly good past few years for RTS fans. It seemed that each year there was a collection of new games advancing the formulas of the last, with many of these games still standing up well over 25 years later. This trend didn't go unnoticed by those in control of the Star Trek license, as in March of 2000 we got the first Star Trek RTS game, Star Trek Armada. Welcome, my name's Azadash and welcome to another PC game retrospective video. As I mentioned in my Total Annihilation video, real-time strategy was never a genre I really got into growing up. Yes, I did play the occasional RTS game, but I rarely spent enough time in any one game to get a real appreciation for it. It wasn't because I specifically disliked RTSs, rather that there were just so many other types of games, such as shooters and adventure games, that I wanted to spend my limited time and budget on more. Now, there were some exceptions to this, RTS games that I did actually enjoy and spend some time with, games like Total Annihilation and Star Trek Armada. What made these games different to me were that they were far more combat-focused as opposed to construction-focused. I mean, yes, you do need to construct bases and so on, but these are all effectively tied to the game's combat system. Another trend in the titles I enjoyed was that they had very simple resource systems, allowing you to adopt more of a set-and-forget approach to resource collection as opposed to one of micromanagement. In Armada, you have two primary resources you need to worry about: dilithium, which can be mined from dilithium moons, and crew, which are populated from starbases. Dilithium will always be the most in-demand material for creation of your units, however the same is true for your adversaries, meaning that crippling their mining facilities early on can have a big impact on how the mission plays out. In terms of the missions, Armada switches perspective between 4 different factions to tell its overarching story: the Federation, Klingons, Romulan, and Borg. And unless I am mistaken, this was the first time you actually got to play as the Borg in a Star Trek game. And let me tell you that for a young Azadash, this was a pretty big deal. And even playing the game for this video, the Borg campaign was by far my most enjoyable. While the game was released in early 2000 for Windows, it has been subsequently re-released by GOG and is available to purchase with better support for modern OSs. Now, I say better because I did encounter a few issues with certain visuals not loading. However, the game never actually crashed. Not perfect, but far from game breaking. There is also an unofficial patch 1.3, which provides a few back-end fixes and importantly provides support for widescreen. I'll drop a link to this in the video description. As far as the story and overall narrative goes, it's actually pretty good. I think it might be the Star Trek game with the most species or factions involved in the main plot. The Federation, the Klingons, the Romulans, the Borg, the Ferengi, the Cardassians, the Sona, the Dominion, even Species 9341, wherever they are, play important roles in the overall plot. Now, you'd think that with this many moving pieces in the plot, it would be a mess, but it's actually not, and that's mostly thanks to each of the 4 main chapters telling both an A and B plot, with the A plot connecting across all of the races, and the B plot being largely specific to that race. Yes, the story does require a little bit of suspension of belief, but when viewed as part of the overall game experience, it's a leap of faith that is a lot easier to make here than it is in other titles. The basic story revolves around the Enterprise encountering a ship from the future who has been sent back to deliver a message about the Federation's impending destruction at the hands of the Borg. As you continue throughout the campaign, you get an understanding of just how the Borg were able to do this and what roles the other factions of the galaxy played, with the ultimate goal of saving everyone. I'll be the first to say that I don't generally like time travel stories when used in Trek. I feel these stories can, at times, provide too many plot conveniences. However, it's wrapped together here with the multiple perspectives really well, and I was genuinely engaged in the story for the duration of the campaign. Before we continue, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's mine some dilithium, assimilate some species, and head back to the year 2000 to remember Star Trek Armada. Having 4 different factions to play as effectively means that you get 4 slightly different gameplay experiences. Now, they are all grounded in the same underlying game systems, but many of the specific mechanics vary between them. For example, you will need to mine dilithium to build ships and structures, regardless of your faction. However, the actual ships and structures you build will be quite different, with different strengths and weaknesses, often requiring a different approach to the gameplay. The Federation are pretty much the all-round faction, with both offensive and defensive options being good but not great. The Klingons, while having very good offensive capabilities, including the boarding of other ships, lack some defensive options and take a lot longer to repair damage. The Romulans, on the other hand, have quite good repair and defensive capabilities, but have weapons which do lower damage and quite poor boarding abilities. Lastly, the Borg excel at boarding, or more so assimilating other ships and repairing themselves, while their other offensive options are not as powerful as some of the others. All in all, regardless of who you're playing as, the game is really well balanced, and although I probably had the most fun playing as the Borg, all of the factions offer up a good amount of unique gameplay, which goes a long way in helping keep the roughly 15-hour-long campaign interesting. Now, of course, if you are spending 15 hours in a game, you want to make sure it gets the basics like camera and control right. The camera is pretty straightforward. You can toggle a variety of zoom options and pan the screen across the field of play. This works fine, and I never encountered any issues whatsoever. The control, on the other hand, is not the best. However, and this is a very important however, it is consistent, meaning that once you understand the nuances of it, you can apply that understanding to your entire playthrough and overcome most issues. The main issue revolves around the grouping of multiple ships and how they react to enemies, and it's a twofold problem. The first issue is that if you have a base which is attacked by enemy forces, only your ships which are in range of firing from their stationary position will actually fire back by default, unless they have been specifically set to engage in combat, something which, when building multiple ships to prepare an attack force, you are not likely to do. What this can result in is your structures or ships being destroyed by a single attacker, despite there being a 10+ strong fleet of friendly ships on the screen. The solution here is that instead of relying on ship defenses for your base, stationary turrets should be built instead. These are quite robust and do a very high amount of sustained damage to enemies. By strategically grouping parts of your base together, you can ensure that pretty much everything is able to be protected by these turrets, therefore dramatically reducing the reliance on ship-based defense. The other issue is more of an offensive one, specifically when you send multiple ship types to an active combat area on the map. The issue is that some ships travel slower than others, which isn't an issue in itself. However, how these ships then regroup themselves when they arrive at their destination is sometimes far from ideal, as the slower ships will essentially position themselves too far away from the combat area to be able to engage, making the ships in front of them, the faster ones in your group, take all of the damage without any support from the slower, often better armored ships behind. The way to get around this is a little more complicated. You either need to actively manage each combat encounter to ensure you can issue new orders and move these ships within range, or you need to be a little bit more deliberate in your grouping to ensure that each ship in a group can contribute. There are some external things like asteroid belts which can complicate this strategy, as they effectively serve as walled-off areas, but all in all, it's fine most of the time. Moving on from the basics, and we come to construction. Now, there's a fairly consistent formula across all of the factions, requiring the construction of various structures in order to unlock the ability to construct more powerful ships and structures. You start with a construction ship which can build 2 base structures, a starbase and a dilithium refinery, both essential items to begin each mission. Once these are constructed, you can then have these construction ships build other basic items like a shipyard and stationary defenses, with other more advanced items like advanced shipyards unlocking as you progress. Some of these structures also have the ability to research new technology, which can unlock new capabilities in your fleet, and these become very important as you progress throughout the game. For example, the Federation have a weapon which, when researched, immobilizes everything within a small area, meaning the enemies, or yourself if you find yourself up against them, cannot move or return fire while it's active. The Borg, likewise, have a very powerful assimilation beam, enabling the rapid assimilation of other vessels, something which makes the Borg campaign a lot easier when used correctly. There's a lot of these different weapons to unlock, and they're all fairly unique and rewarding, and scale to pretty much every ship in your fleet. These weapons are powered by a special energy meter which needs to be triggered by the player, and when depleted recharges slowly over time. One of the good things about this approach is that it gives the player a reason to play an active role in combat as opposed to just sending ships in and watching it unfold from afar. Indeed, combat in general is very solid here, and unlike some other RTSs, often requires substantial changes in tactics as you progress throughout a mission. This is most evident in an early Federation mission, which sees you being outgunned and needing to run from some Klingons, before finding a derelict ship which you can then board and assume control of to help even up the odds. In terms of enemy AI, it's actually really good, as in quite a challenge even on the medium difficulty setting. The enemy AI is not afraid to attack your base early on either, meaning you always need to strike a balance between building up a defensive perimeter and building ships to take on the objectives. Likewise, if you're going to expand your base early on and say build a dilithium mine quite a way away, you need to ensure that it is well protected, as once the enemy discovers it, they will likely try and destroy it. Mission structure and pacing is likewise good, and with what the game has in the way of systems to work with, it offers quite a variety of missions with a fairly steady ramping difficulty. Although I will say that I found the Romulan missions to be the hardest to complete, as even their highest level ship is really something of a glass cannon, and I'm not really convinced that the cloaking device offers too much in the way of a combat advantage, especially given you can't recharge shields while it's active. Overall, the best way I can describe the gameplay of Armada is fun and consistent. Yes, there are some challenges, but never anything which really overshadows the fun factor. While Armada doesn't push any technical boundaries, it does deliver a mostly competent presentation. The game world is sufficiently detailed, all of the factions have unique artwork and animations, and the cutscenes do a good enough job of telling a story. Oh, and as an added bonus, if you speed up some of the cutscenes slightly, you really get some DJ and dance floor vibes. Menus are fine, as is the quick save and load system, although there is one curious option, and that is the Director's Cut. Basically, with Director's Cut on, ships dogfight, as in move around when in combat. However, with it off, ships remain stationary. The game manual explains that having this off makes combat selection easier, which I'd probably agree with, but at the end of the day, it's more of a personal preference, I think, and I couldn't really tell a major difference between combat either way. While the game does feature the same action window that was found in Dominion Wars, it thankfully doesn't feature the same performance, with the game running perfectly on modern hardware. As I mentioned in the intro, there were a few strange graphical bugs which required a save and reload, but nothing game-breaking. Sound design is excellent. Voice acting is used extensively here, and it just adds so much more personality to the factions, not to mention the cutscenes. There's a good list of actors reprising their roles here, with Patrick Stewart's performance a clear standout.
The legendary Captain Picard. It's an honor to meet you, sir.
Captain Deming, you and your ship do not appear in the Starfleet database. Do you have an explanation for this?
That is because it does not yet exist. I've come from the future to warn the Federation of an impending Borg invasion.
Effects are all universe appropriate, combined with well-balanced music, which helps keep the tension up and action flowing.
Station is under attack.
I really can't fault anything with regards to the sound design, it's definitely full marks here. Star Trek Armada is an interesting case, because while its aggregated reviews for the time fell into the 7 out of 10 range, it did do well enough to get a sequel, Armada 2, released in 2001, and for all intents and purposes, that was rated around 6 out of 10. 25 odd years later, and we still haven't seen another entry in the Armada series. Now, there have been other Star Trek RTS games released, such as New Worlds and Infinite, but interestingly, both of these have aggregated review scores in the 6s, with some user reviews being much lower. This suggests that there is an opportunity to make a good Star Trek RTS game, but that going back to the original Armada formula might be the best approach. One of the questions that always comes up in Star Trek reviews is, will someone who doesn't know much about Star Trek still enjoy it? And in the case of Armada, I would say yes, it is still possible to enjoy the gameplay. However, the story experience is greatly improved by having a little bit of Trek knowledge, especially relating to the Next Generation series. For me, Armada is still an easy recommendation, regardless of fandom. It is not a perfect game, but it is a fun game which tells an interesting story backed by a great cast. If you haven't played it, do yourself a favor and check it out. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.